Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. Hello and welcome to another episode of Undercurrent Stories podcast. Do you use a fitness tracker? Do you ever read or leave reviews on TripAdvisor or Amazon? Have you read the weather forecast today? And what about polls for elections? All these are just a few examples of the use of statistics. It seems that statistics, data and algorithms are increasingly used to inform, educate and persuade us. And then on another level, how can we make sense of the odds of something? Could it be the odds of winning the jackpot on a lottery, or even the chance of being struck by lightning? We may regard ourselves as lucky or unlucky. So the big question is, on one hand, we have the science and all the data to give us considered answers. And on the other, our society's belief and superstition with such things as bad luck happens in threes, touching a piece of wood for luck, four-leaf clovers and black cats. What is the answer? Well, here to help us make sense of it all, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Jeffrey Rosenthal. Jeffrey is a professor of statistics at the University of Toronto and author of several books, with his most recent book being, knock on wood, Luck, Chance and the Meaning of Everything. Hello and welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
Hello, thank you very much.
It's great to have you on. Before we talk about the hard science of statistics, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your life growing up, and how you developed an interest in mathematics and then statistics?
Sure. Well, actually, I'm a bit unusual in that I had other mathematicians in my family. So my father was a math professor and my mother was a math instructor at college. And my dad's dad had been a high school math teacher, and I have an uncle who was a sort of computer science professor. So unlike a lot of my classmates, when I was studying maths in my undergraduate and so on, it seemed like a perfectly normal choice to say, oh yeah, I think when I grow up, I want to be a mathematician or a professor of mathematics. And it was sort of a natural thing to do. And certainly my family had always discussed mathematical things more than most families do. And so I always had a bit of an interest in the sort of mathematical side of things, and even probabilities, although I didn't get back to probabilities until I went to graduate school. But growing up, we used to play games like Monopoly, and there was always a question of what's the probability that he's going to make a roll that's going to make him land on my Monopoly property. So I was always sort of interested in those things.
Was there a particular point where you thought, yeah, statistics is definitely for me, Jeffrey?
Yeah, well, actually, the interest in probability and statistics came later. So as an undergraduate, I took a lot of math classes, including some advanced math classes, and I took a fair bit of physics. I took some computer science. I did not take any probability or statistics classes at all. And when I started graduate school, I thought I wanted to work in mathematical physics, which is sort of technical math applied to complicated things like string theory and these exotic physics theories. But then it got very hard and complicated and abstract and didn't really have the sort of immediate touch that I liked. And meanwhile, I was just auditing a class about probability, and there, hey, it had real world applications. You could understand the questions really well. It was kind of fun. And it reminded me of my early days calculating the probabilities for Monopoly and so on. And next thing you knew, I dropped the mathematical physics and switched into mathematical probability theory, which in turn gradually led me more into statistics. So the turn towards probability and statistics was actually a later sort of more gradual thing.
And I'm always very curious about how and why people are good at maths. I mean, if I just use myself as a case study, I once, when I first went to, we call it senior school here, so when I was sort of 11 or 12, I actually came first in maths. I think it was joint first with somebody else. And I put that down to the fact that it was sort of it was pre-algebra, and it was all very logical, and I quite enjoyed it. And I think I was probably slightly scared by the teacher because he was quite a ferocious chap. And it was in the days of corporal punishment. If you didn't do what you were told, you got a slap. So I think there was a bit of a scare. So that's probably saying more about me than. But then I found that, and you probably, I don't know what you could say on this, but then I found that as I got older, my understanding of the concepts became more difficult. And I always wanted to know why, but there was never enough time in the class to sort of get a full answer about why. So you tended to sort of fall back. But then you look at probably somebody like yourself, Jeffrey, where you've obviously got this natural aptitude to be able to take this information in. Can you relate to that at all? Do you find, did you see students with the same sort of issues that I had? And did you sort of find yourself and others that you could just go ahead, and was it a case of perhaps you didn't ask too many questions, you just accepted a lot? How did it work? I'm very interested.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of complicated issues there. Now, I have read somewhat about the phenomenon sometimes called math anxiety, you might have heard of. And in particular, one thing that can happen to a lot of people is maybe a bit like what happened to you, where everything seems fine for a while and you're keeping up and you're getting your A's in your math class, but then suddenly something new happens and you don't understand it, and you realize you didn't really understand the stuff before that, and you really didn't understand the stuff before that. And I think part of it is that when you're learning elementary mathematics, you can sort of succeed maybe on different levels. And I think it's possible for some students to succeed well because they just sort of know how to answer the questions, or whenever they say difference, I better subtract. You just get some sort of little rules in there that allows you to keep up. But mathematics so much builds upon itself that you need to have a good sort of fundamental understanding of the structures in order to move ahead. And why it works better for some people than others is, of course, the mystery. There's the whole nature versus nurture debates, and as part of it genetics, but it's certainly part of it is what you're exposed to. And in my case, I was actually fortunate having such a mathematical family that people would discuss things on sort of a level of really understanding them, even when I was younger. So I think probably I got a solid understanding in a sort of foundational way of those early things. So when the new things came along, they fit right in, as opposed to what sometimes happens, and this sometimes happens to female students, especially. They talk about math anxiety, where you suddenly feel like, oh my God, I'm a fraud. I didn't understand any of it. And it's a question of what you understood previously and how it all built up. So, I had a lot of advantages, and I recognize that in the sense of being exposed to a deeper understanding of things right at the beginning. So I had a good foundation to build on. And since math, more than probably any other subject, the next thing builds on the previous thing. And the more you've got a solid understanding of the previous thing, the more the next thing is going to fit into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing I did notice on the research that I did about your work and some of the communication that you've been doing on a particularly sort of complicated, or not complicated, but a very sophisticated subject is your ability to be able to almost distill a lot of what you might consider to be complex academic stuff, but to the general public. So I guess that's why you talk to the media quite a lot, and I go on podcasts and that sort of thing. You find it quite easy to communicate. Is that right?
Well, that was also something that developed quite gradually. And in fact, I'd say around the time I first got my PhD and so on, I was pretty good at the technical side of things, but I wouldn't say I was particularly good at distilling it down into a simple thing for people who hadn't already studied a lot of math. And in fact, I think a lot of people who work in mathematics or other technical fields feel a certain frustration that, you're working on all these things, they all seem really interesting. And then you meet someone at a party and you say, oh, let me explain why it's so interesting what I'm working on. And what you say just seems like gibberish to them. And it's, this technical stuff that they don't understand. And, you think, gee, how can I explain it to them unless they study for years and go to graduate school and so on? And you end up, not being able to communicate very well what you're doing. And I sort of felt this frustration, and it took me a while to sort of find ways to get beyond it. For one thing, I did start doing a little more of performing things like improvisational comedy. So I got more into performing for a group. And also I just sort of started to think about it. Just because you understand something on a technical level doesn't mean you understand how to explain it to someone who hasn't also studied that same technical stuff that you have. And it takes some work. And so I started to think more about it, and, what's a good analogy, what's a good way to explain it. And then that eventually sort of dovetailed with my wife's family are not mathematicians, and they have writers and journalists in the family. And one of them said, hey, you should write a book for the general public about this math stuff. And I thought, gee, well, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. And they introduced me to an agent, and the agent got me a contract. And next thing I knew, I had to write a book, and I had to really stop and think long and hard. What can I say that's interesting and entertaining and accessible that people who haven't spent the last years going to university studying math like I have? And it was quite a transition for me. But I think I eventually reached the point where I am able to, with some effort still, but I'm able to distill things to try to explain them to general people. Achieve it.
Yeah. So statistics. I mean, I mentioned in the beginning some examples of statistics that we all use every day and what they're used for. I guess it would be sensible just to sort of have a definition, a simple definition of what statistics are.
One thing, of course, that sometimes is called statistics is just the collection of data. So maybe you measure everybody's height, or you measure everybody's weight, or you compute the gross domestic product of your country. You're just obtaining the sort of facts and figures, but to me, that's not really what the practice of statistics is. Statistics is more how to analyze that data. So we think you've got some data, maybe people's medical histories or financial records or whatever it is, and then you want to draw a conclusion from that. What can you say about is this person going to have a heart attack? Is the country going to go into recession? Who's going to win the election, and so on? And it's a question of what you can conclude and with what level of certainty based on the data that you have. So to me, that's really what statistics as a practice is about. It's like you've already got this data, or somebody collected the data, or you've got some information, and then how do you reason with it? And there's always uncertainties involved because you just have a certain amount of data and you're trying to reason with it. And to me, that's what statistics is.
We've got an election, a general election next week, right, and the polls are predicting a big sway over to the other side. How have polls changed over the years? How have they evolved, and how much attention should we actually pay to them when we consider that, from my understanding, that it's only a few thousand people at a time that are used as a sample? How much attention should we pay to them, Jeffrey?
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues with polls. I get asked about them a lot, as you can imagine, and there's a few things to say. One is, the fact that it's only a few thousand people. If those few thousand people were truly chosen at random, equally likely to be any of the millions of people who are going to vote, and then you had a sample, then that would actually be pretty good. So that's what statisticians are good at, is saying if you have a random sample that's truly random, what can you learn from it? And it turns out with even just a few thousand, you can think of it as that's a few thousand experiments, each of which is, hey, what fraction of people are going to vote for a conservative, or what fraction are going to vote for Labor? And it's kind of like if maybe you flipped a coin a few thousand times. Well, you get pretty close to figuring out that it's 50-50 heads or tails. So a few thousand experiments, if they're good experiments, are actually pretty good. So that's not the problem. The problem is it's very hard for pollsters to get a truly random sample. And it's always been hard, but it's gotten even harder. And one issue is what they call the response rate. That is, usually pollsters will phone people at random. And the hope is somebody answers the phone, says, oh, nice to hear from you. Sure, here's my opinions about the election. Even in the glory days of polling, maybe in let's say the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was maybe 1/3 of the time somebody would actually answer the phone and give you the information and get a sample. So you're always wondering, is that just at random that we're getting 1/3 of the people, or are those 1/3 of the people a little bit different than the 2/3 who aren't answering? Here's the problem. The response rate is now well below 10%. It's usually just a few percent, depending on who you ask. Pollsters don't like to discuss it too much, but it's just a few percentage of people who are willing, who are home or at least have their phone handy, because there's a question whether they can even call cell phones or they have to pay extra for that. And then they call and they're actually home. They actually answer and talk to a stranger, and they actually say, sure, I've got a few minutes to chat with you. That's becoming a rarer and rarer thing. So the problem isn't so much that it's a few thousand people. It's that it's a few thousand people who are chosen from this weird set of a few percent of the population who are actually willing to answer pollsters. And then you have to wonder, is that few percent a representative sample of the rest? And the good news is, they could be. Just because somebody's willing to stay home and answer polls doesn't mean they're totally different from somebody who isn't. But that can lead to biases. And one famous bias, which it seems happened in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, which is one of the things people cite because, of course, that's where Donald Trump was predicted to lose the election, but he won it, is that the kind of people who supported Trump, well, they tended to not trust authority, and they tended to not trust the media, and they tended to not trust, among other things, not trust polling companies. So they were a little bit even less likely to answer the phone and talk to pollsters. And that meant that pollsters undercounted Trump supporters a little bit. And the election was close enough that made a big difference. The good news I can say for you in the UK is that Labour's got such a big lead right now that whatever biases and twists and turns there are, I'd be astonished if it made any difference. And it seems overwhelmingly likely that Labour is going to win this election. And even if the polls are off by a little bit, but if there's an election which is kind of close, like the 2016 U.S. presidential election or the upcoming U.S. presidential election, then boy, a few percentage off can make all the difference. And that's where things get pretty hairy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know where you're coming from. The other sort of thought I always have on these sorts of things is when you look at the situation with Labour in the UK at the moment and the what looks like an almost certain swing, I wonder if that influences certain people who perhaps sort of think, well, it looks like that I'm not going to bother voting or something. I just wonder whether the actual poll itself has an impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I think absolutely polls can have an impact. And most people don't like to admit that they impact them. In fact, I once saw a survey. They said, hey, do polls have an impact on your election? And 89% said affirm, no, they do not. I think they were wrong. I mean, you could say they were either lying or just not understanding themselves that well. But I think it's inevitable. And there can be a few influences. One is sometimes politicians like to play up if they're winning in the poll. They're like, hey, I'm a I'm a winner. Don't you want to vote for the winner? Isn't that going to be great? But it can also have issues to do with strategic voting. Well, one thing is, as I say, if you think your candidate's going to win easily, you say, oh, it's not worth voting, but gee, my candidate's really in trouble. I better get out and vote. But sometimes it can be the flip. If nobody else is going to vote for my candidate, maybe I shouldn't bother either. So it can have complicated influences, and also can have specifically strategic voting. That is, if you have, say, like a riding system, as happens in the UK and also in Canada, then you could say, you know what, my riding is, pretty conservative, so the Liberal Democrats don't have a chance, but if I vote for Labour, I might be able to beat the Conservative or that kind of thing. And so you can actually use local polling information to help you make a smart strategic vote too. So some people do that as well. So polls definitely do have an influence. But I think sometimes people sort of overstate that and they say, oh, we shouldn't have any polls because it's terrible. They have this influence, or, the election's meaningless because it was all based on what people thought in the polls. And I mean, I think it's okay. People can base their choice partially on what they think is happening in the polls, and that's part of democracy too. So I don't see a problem with it, but I'd say definitely polls can have an influence on people's votes. Yeah.
And while we're talking about politicians and data, there seems to be more and more accessibility of data that one can get hold of these days, which I guess is, we're in an information age and everything's, uses algorithms and things like that. In terms of a politician, if you see a politician espousing a load of a view about something because he's basing or she's basing it on some data, the other sort of question we've got as the sort of members of the public, how much can we trust some of this data? Because it's very easy for somebody to say, I don't know, 50% of this is this. How can we actually check data?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a real problem. I think, people used to think if only people had access to more information, then we'd all be better informed and we'd make good choices and the country would run better and so on. And I think the sad truth of our modern times is learning that that's not really the case. And in some sense, we have access maybe to too much information in the sense that, as you say, there's so many things out there. And then you start to wonder, which stuff is true and you also just which stuff is relevant or the most important. And you sort of get drowned in a sea of it. So it means that people, whether it's politicians or people in social media and so on, at the very least, can sort of emphasize little bits of data which are not really representative of the whole. But then in the worst case, which happens a lot now, just say things that are completely false or completely misrepresenting things, or saying crime rates are going up when they're actually going down, and saying that the economy is getting worse when it's actually getting better. And sadly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of checks on that. That is to say, to me, if somebody, let's say a politician, says something which, can be checked according to the official, the government economic indicators and found to be completely false, that politician should suffer for it. People should say, we can't trust this guy, he's lying to us. But it doesn't happen that much. And people more and more are very easy to just speak up and say things that are completely false. And, maybe somebody else says they're wrong, and then it gets lost in a sea of social media. And or they say that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is just getting out of bed or something like that. So in other words, lies can spread very quickly on social media and so on. And even in the mainstream media, they're really not checked so much. And also some mainstream media now has their own agenda, and they'll push things which, really are not the case and are misleading. So it is a real problem. And what I think people can do is look up, official crime statistics, official economic indicators and so on. But let's face it, a lot of people aren't going to do that and are going to be stuck on these impressions. And I just wish, to me, saying something that's completely false should be a bad thing, and you should not trust someone because they do that. In reality, politicians and others do it a lot, and they mostly get away with it. So I don't know.
Have you had, moving away from the politicians, we have quite a section there on politics. Have you had much to do with business and the corporate world and how they use statistics to assist their commercial growth in business?
Well, somewhat. I mean, I've done some consulting work here and there. My main work is an academic, so I fortunately don't need to worry about where my next paycheck is coming from and all that. But I've done sort of consulting work. And yeah, there's a lot of ways in which statistics impacts the commercial world and private industries, of course. And, at least with them, it's clear what the motivations are. It's not like politicians you can't necessarily trust with them. They want to make more money. They want to say, how can I use this statistics to make me more money? So could be anything from predicting, future population growth and demographics, because that'll affect, how many new buildings and how many hospitals and how many this is and whatever in schools we need. But it could also be things, it involved once with an oil company, and it had to do with how much liability insurance they had to pay because of what was the risk of a catastrophic accident and these kind of things. So there's all sorts of ways, and certainly in the financial world, I mean, there's all these crazy stock options that people buy and sell, contingency, this and that. And there's all these mathematical models which price them, and then people buy and sell them according to their different mathematical models. And it's a huge world out there. I mean, the good thing in a way about statistics is it applies to really almost everything. Anything when you have, large amounts of data and large amounts of things that are happening, and you don't know the future, which we hardly ever do. So we're always looking to estimate and approximate and forecast and so on. And it's really quite interesting, but it's not necessarily always for the public good. We all know about when there have been, say, stock crashes because everybody's mathematical model predicts that the stock's going down, and then suddenly everybody's selling, and then it plummets. And that was, I guess, the 2008 financial crisis. They say was largely caused by these mathematical models kind of going out of control. And so it's not always for the best, but certainly businesses are always focused on how to make more money, and they do sometimes consult with people like me in terms of doing statistics and forecasting and estimation in different contexts. That is all related to trying to learn these unknowns, right? Because if you know what's going to happen next, you can make a lot of money off of that.
Yes. And what about health? I mean, obviously we had the pandemic 4 years ago, and I know that they were using mathematical models and science to sort of have a look at what the spread was going to be like. Have you personally got involved with the health side of things?
A little bit. I am a co-author on a couple of papers about statistics of things related to the COVID pandemic. And, a lot of it, was about trying to forecast the future or even estimate the present, right? Because especially testing, even at the height, not everyone was being tested all the time. And now pretty much no one's ever being tested. So there's a question of what is happening with COVID and how many people are suffering from it and how widespread is it and so on. And those were big things. And trying to figure out the reporting, like one paper I was involved in, discovered that more people were being diagnosed as dying of COVID on weekdays than on weekends. It's like, well, that's weird. COVID shouldn't affect that. But that had to do with the reporting mechanisms, and maybe the person who reports the statistics doesn't come in until Monday and so on. So just things like that about trying to understand all this sheaf of data and trying to understand what's going on out there. I mean, there was a huge amount of work in statistics and other subjects on that, and trying to make the best of a challenging situation. And then, of course, the vaccines came in. So there was a lot of science and statistics that was spawned by it. And trying to deal with it. And certainly the events of the day can have an impact on what's the most important for statistics as well.
And what about crime? I mean, I've got two questions, actually, a little forked question on this one. I was talking to a former policeman. One of the things he said is the subject of crime scams. He said that he thought that statistics were having to play catch up on how they can measure what's going on with crime, but particularly in the new sort of scam things that are going on at the moment. How would you react to that?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends which scams you're talking about, because certainly there are the sort of online things where they try to get your credit card number somehow, or phishing things where they try to get you to click on the wrong link and so on. And then there's phone things where they phone you up, and I've heard, they phone an old person and say, oh, your grandson's in jail and you have to do this to get him out, and it's all just made up. So there's a lot of
all of the above.
Horrible scams. Yeah, all of the above and more. So there's a lot of scams out there, and some of them aren't so much about a statistical issue as just people lying to you and needing to, everyone should be skeptical if someone calls you up and tells you need to send some Bitcoin to this address or you'll be arrested for tax fraud. Well, maybe check who's calling before you send the money, right? Those are sort of obvious things to say that aren't so statistical. But then from a statistical point of view, one thing that people talk about a lot is sort of trends with crime, and is crime getting worse? Is crime really serious, and so on? And there's certainly some people get the impression that crime, especially violent crime, is much more serious than it really is. And I mean, not sort of more serious, but more prevalent, I should say. And that's for a few reasons. And one is that there's sometimes what I call an observational bias or a headline bias, which is if there's some horrible, gruesome murder, then it's front page news and we all hear about it for days. Whereas if people are just living their lives and nobody's doing anything bad to them, that is not front page news and we don't hear about that. So, and in particular, the reach of media is so big now that if there's a horrible, gruesome crime, anywhere in our city or maybe anywhere in our country or maybe anywhere in the world, that can be front page news. So you realize it's a horrible thing that happened, but out of, I sometimes call it the out of how many principle, that is, out of how many, families and people that actually had a perfectly fine day yesterday. And, that's not to minimize the seriousness of what did happen, but it's to put it in perspective in terms of, most people were not murdered yesterday. Most people, in the vast majority, were not murdered and we're fine. So that's one thing. And then also, it gets back a little bit to the politicians lying and so on, that a lot of people make claims about crime rates going up when, you can just check the police statistics and find out that they're just lying to us. And so I think people tend to get sometimes a misleading feeling about crimes, based on not looking at the statistics. And some of those things, the thing is, it's so easy to debunk them. You don't have to be a brilliant statistician to just say, how many murders were there last year, how many murders were there this year, and to say things like, well, that's one murder out of how much of the population. So just a little bit of thinking about the bigger numbers or the wider context can give a bit of perspective. So that's one thing I'd say. But as far as specific scams, there certainly are a lot, and especially in the modern online world, there's people are more vulnerable. You don't need to break into someone's house to rob them. You can just do things with their computer, maybe.
One question you must always get asked, and you're probably waiting for me to ask it. Those people who take part in lotteries, what does the data tell us about the chance of actually winning a lottery in terms, and are a certain set of numbers better than others? What does the data tell us, Jeffrey? Yeah, so it's true. Actually, when I wrote the first book about probabilities for general audience, I wrote about all kinds of things. And I mentioned lotteries a little bit, but it turned out to be, as your question implied, that the thing I get asked about more than anything else is lotteries. And, when I was publicizing the book, I would always know when the lottery jackpot was especially big, not because I followed it closely, but because my phone would start ringing and the reporter would say, hey, what's the odds that somebody's going to win this big jackpot tonight? And it's a huge industry. People love lotteries, not me, but a lot of other people love lotteries. And the first and most obvious thing to say is that if you buy a lottery ticket, the chance you're going to win the jackpot is always incredibly small. It's one chance in millions and millions, and it depends on which lottery exactly how many millions, but it's one chance in lots of millions. And it sort of has to be that way because, simple way to think about it is the lottery makes money for the government that runs them usually, and it only makes money because your chance of winning the jackpot is smaller than the ratio of the jackpot to the amount you spent on your ticket. So in other words, if you just spend, like a few dollars or a few quid on your ticket, then the chance of winning millions and millions of pounds or dollars is going to be less than that one chance in the millions and millions of the ratio of the price. So in other words, that's the first thing to say. And sometimes I'll try to make analogies. I'll say things like depending on the lottery, but if you have to drive to the other side of town to a store to buy your ticket, in some cases, you're more likely to die in an automobile crash driving to the store than you are to have that ticket win the jackpot and so on. So just sort of all sorts of ways, it's just astronomically unlikely. And yet people love it. And I think there's a real psychological feeling that people will, dream about, if only I win this lottery, then I could do this and then I could buy that. And they really sort of think they have a chance. And sometimes they think, it's my lucky day or, these numbers are my lucky numbers. And somehow something is going to overcome these odds of one in millions and millions. And my attitude is if people are just having a little fun with it and it causes them to dream about, what they might do, that's fine. But sometimes you hear about people who actually don't have much money and spend all their money on lottery tickets hoping to get their big break. And generally it's sad because the odds are very much against them and it could have a real problem for them that they're spending so much money. So that's sort of far and away the number one thing to say about lotteries is the chance of winning that jackpot is so small. It's just not going to happen to you. And another thing, people, of course, when somebody does win the lottery company publicizes that, and that's the front page news. And look, this giant lottery was won, and isn't this such a nice man who won this lottery? And people think, yeah, it could happen to me too. Just like when there's a gruesome crime, people think, oh my gosh, that could happen to me. Someone wins the lottery, hey, that could happen to me. But they're both so unlikely that they're just not going to happen to you. Have you ever done any work that you've been commissioned to do that you think, actually, I'm really, really proud of that? I've done something that's helped either a person or a group of people as a result of doing something. Have you got anything that you could share with us at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I've done, I've been involved in a few things that were sort of interesting and potentially impactful. The thing I did that had the biggest impact actually was what was related to lotteries. Actually, it was the so-called lottery retailer scandal, and this is something that was front page news in Canada for a long time, and it spread somewhat to other countries, although less so. I'm not sure if there was any issue in the UK with it, but it had to do with the issue that was discovered that sometimes people would buy a lottery ticket at their local shop, and then turns out a lot of people wouldn't bother to check themselves if they won the jackpot. They just bring the ticket back to the shop and say, hey, here's my ticket. Can you check if I won anything? And occasionally the store owner would say, oh, no, you didn't win anything. Or maybe, oh, you just won a free ticket. Here you go. And then the store owner would keep the ticket for themselves and cash in the big prize. And it turned out there were some cases, well, there was one case that was discovered and it was sort of hush-hush for a while. And then a news organization in Canada found out about it. And they hired me to sort of investigate the numbers to see whether this was happening with others as well. And so we looked at how many of the people who've won these big lottery jackpots over the recent years, how many of them were people who actually worked at or owned these shops that were selling lottery tickets. And we found that it was considerably more than would be expected just by random chance alone. And it became this huge scandal and people were outraged and the police investigated and they ended up arresting several shopkeepers and sometimes trying to figure out who had originally won that ticket, who had been ripped off from their ticket. And in one case found this nice group of 7 men who played the lottery every week had won over $12 million and it had been claimed by the shop owner instead, and they were able to refund their money plus interest. So it was this huge, crazy story, and it did involve, first of all, some people being arrested for fraud and then some other people having their prizes restored, and all started from really a quite simple statistical analysis of, hey, how many times are these shop owners winning tickets compared to what we'd expect.
So if we move on to the sort of dynamic between, well, I mentioned earlier on in the introduction about luck and probability and chances of things happening to people. I noticed, first of all, that you're born on Friday the 13th.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I didn't even know, like most people, I knew my birthday in terms of that I was born on October 13th, but I didn't particularly know what day of the week that had been. And I think a lot of people might not know. But then when I reached adulthood and started using computers with calendar programs or even writing my own, I thought, let's go back and fill in the day that I was born. Oh, that's a Friday. That's interesting. And so I just sort of mentioned it as an amusing thing for a while. But then when people, I'd written the first book, Struck by Lightning, The Curious World of Probabilities, about probability and randomness in our lives everywhere. And then I get all sorts of questions about lotteries and crime and polls and all the things we've talked about. And then sometimes people would say, yeah, but do you believe in luck? And it's like, well, hang on, what do you mean exactly luck? And people mean a lot of different things, but some of it's related, to superstition and destiny and fate and, things happening for a reason and all these kind of things. And I thought that's kind of a hard thing to discuss. And I ended up writing the second book, Knock on Wood, and it was partially to try to answer those questions. And so one thing I played up was, hey, by the way, I was born on Friday the 13th. So some people believe that's an unlucky thing, but actually I've been quite fortunate in my life so far. In fact, I wanted to call that book Born on Friday the 13th, which I thought was a nice title and related to, there was this book and movie called Born on the 4th of July you may have heard of. But anyway, but then at the last minute, the publishers decided that would be too obscure and they went with Knock on Wood instead. But so to me, it was just a convenient example. I just happened to be born on Friday the 13th. But I mean, if you really believe in the logic of all these superstitions and luck and so on, then I should have had a lot of misfortune in my life. And, I'm pleased to say that mostly I've actually been pretty fortunate in my life. So much for the theory about Friday the 13th.
The concept of luck. A lot of people would say things happen in threes, for example. People always say that buses turn up in threes.
Yeah, I would say that, I discuss a lot of those things in the book, Knock on Wood. And a lot of it comes down to, what we could call a biased observation. So the same way people think they're going to be murdered because there was a murder on the front page news, or they think they're going to win the lottery because there was a lottery winner on the front page news. People will notice certain things more than others. And if things happen once all the time, and you just talk about the thing that happened, but you don't talk about whether it's part of a trend. Things happen twice fairly often. Things will happen twice, and you might say it happened again, but you might not make a thing about it. then it happens a third time. You think, wow, this is really a trend. It happened a third time. So, I think this thing about things come in threes is really nothing more than people noticing when it happens the third time. Oh, that's pretty interesting, and making a fuss about it. And sometimes it happens a fourth time too. But people noticing when it happens the third time. There's no, like a lot of these sort of superstitions and luck, there's just no causal reason. And how could there be, a sort of causal scientific reason why, two of these things have happened? Well, the third thing better happen, and it depends on what the thing is, but usually they'd happen kind of independently or from different causes or whatever. And, it's just a lot of things like people think, if they're carrying a rabbit's foot, then something good's going to happen to them, or if they see a 4-leaf clover, or all these things, or, if you see a black cat, that's bad luck, and so on. And people tend to believe those things. And in my mind, first of all, there's a psychological reason that people feel a need to think that all this randomness out there must be some reason for it. There must be some control of it. There must be some influence. So if they can say, oh, yeah, well, that must be because I saw that black cat, then it gives them a certain sense of comfort. And then also, again, it's the biased observation. If you see the black cat and then something bad happens, and that must have been because of the black cat. But if nothing bad happens, you just kind of forget about it. So people observe that. I have a story I could tell about the play Macbeth. I'm sure you know that the Shakespeare play Macbeth. A lot of people think,
Yes.
That's cursed. You can't even say the name. You certainly can't quote from it, and so on. And happens to be one of my favorite plays, so I do quote from it from time to time. And once I was at a party, and I just mentioned to someone that I quoted from it, and she was just horrified. Oh my God, that's terrible. Did something bad happen to you? It's like, no, not really. Well, you may be. She could tell I was skeptical. I said, you may be skeptical, but my son, he was skeptical too, and he quoted from Macbeth. And then the next week, he was planning a trip, and he discovered that his passport had expired 2 years earlier. How do you explain that? And to her, this was convincing, right? Because, hey, he quoted Macbeth, and something bad happened to him. And, I tried to say logically, just how could that be? Like, did this passport, it hadn't expired 2 years ago until he quoted from Macbeth, and then suddenly it changed to being expired 2 years ago? There's just no logic to it. And, again, if nothing bad had happened, she would have forgotten it. And that's a fairly mild bad thing to happen. And yet to her, that was proof, because people look for these connections and they'll believe them if they do. And we had to agree to disagree on that one.
What sort of reaction do you get from people who've read the book, who perhaps, because every other person you speak to, they'll say something like, "Oh, I've had my 3 bits of bad luck today. I won't get any more." Or I think the black cat thing's different in the UK from the US, because I think it's in the UK it's good luck if you see a black cat, but bad luck if you're, I don't know, halfway across the Atlantic. It must change, I guess, if you're in a plane.
Yeah.
What sort of reaction do you get from people?
Yeah, I do get a lot of reactions. One of the problems with writing the book, people told me, and it may be true, is that in some sense it's going to preach to the converted. That is, people who are open to statistical, scientific explanation for things, and the argument that maybe that there's superstitions don't stand up to scrutiny. They're maybe going to read and enjoy my book, and it's just going to reinforce what they believe. And people who seriously believe in some of these superstitions, which a lot of people do, as I've well discovered, and as you mentioned, probably a book from someone like me is not going to particularly dissuade them, and they might think, well, yeah, you have your fancy statistics, but I know, I know what happened when I quoted Macbeth or when I this or that, and I think if people are really set on believing those things, they're going to find, by selective observation, they're going to find some evidence to support it, and they're going to continue to believe it. And I think some people really believe it on sort of a visceral level, and it a little bit defies logical argument, because you can say, people have, for example, with things like ESP and so on, people have set up controlled experiments, and psychics, you claim you can figure out, well, here's some random list of people, and here's a random list of their reactions and so on. And as you can imagine, when people set up controlled experiments, they almost always do not show any significant effect from these various superstitions. But people aren't convinced. Some people say, yeah, but that's because in these cold scientific experimental settings it doesn't work. But when I'm walking home alone, that's when it really kicks in, and things like that. And they're just going to want to believe them. And in a way, it's not the most harmful thing ever that people do believe them, but it does run counter to what we understand about science. And in some cases, there's just no sort of scientifically plausible way that this could possibly influence that. And yet people do want to believe it, and people do believe it.
And have you always thought that, even when you were younger, or is it something that the more and more you've got into statistics, you've realised that there's a big question mark over some of those superstitions?
Well, I was never very superstitious, so I'd say pretty much. And again, maybe that's the fortune of growing up in a family where people discuss science and mathematics things more than the average family. But people sometimes ask me, do you ever feel your own superstitious feelings? And I have to confess that it's a very human reaction, and I do sometimes. There was one. Here's going back. We mentioned the 2016 election of Donald Trump in the United States, and I actually, it so happens, I made a little bet just for $2 with a professor of political science. He was goading me into betting that Trump would win, but I didn't think Trump would win, but I thought he might, and he said he'd give me a 2 to 1 odds. So I guess it was his $2 against my $1. So just a very little bet, but the Trump win. So I took that bet, and then when to everyone's surprise Trump won, I had this sudden feeling maybe it's because I took that bet. I was betting that Trump was going to win, and I somehow caused Trump to win. And it took me just a second to realize how absurd that was, because how could my little bet have possibly influenced the results of this big election? But I did have that feeling, and that's one of a few times when I have to confess that despite and this was after I'd written books and so on, and logically speaking, there's nothing to this, but I think there's a very human reaction there to somehow believe that something caused something else. And I did feel, again, and not to minimize, I didn't just joke about it. I actually had that feeling, and I recognize that people can have that feeling, and maybe it's a very human thing to believe there are certain causes even when there aren't there.
And if we leave planet Earth for just a moment, what would statistics say about the possibility of life of any form in the universe? Is that something that you've sort of thought about?
Yeah, well, people certainly talk about it, and I'm fascinated. I grew up watching Star Trek and thinking about other planets and what's out there, and are there other species out there? And people. There's something called the Drake equation that you might have heard of, and this was a guy named Drake who was a sort of astronomer interested in these things, and he said, well, the number of civilizations out there. Well, he started and he sort of multiplies, the number of different stars and the number of different galaxies and so on, and then how many planets are around those stars, and all these different places where there could be life. So you end up with this huge number of possibilities. But then, of course, you have to multiply by the probability of life developing on any one of those planets. So you end up saying there's huge, as Carl Sagan said, billions and billions, and really it's maybe more than that if you take the whole universe of potential planets out there that could possibly have some form of life on them. And then you have to multiply that by what's the chance that on a random planet there's going to be life that develops. So you have a huge, huge big number multiplied by a tiny, tiny, tiny number. And I think people, as they're being honest, nobody really knows, how that multiplies out and what the chance is that there's life out there. Now, I mean, as you probably know, people have been searching for a while now. There's the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and they've been pointing telescopes out there and measuring different things and not finding a single shred of evidence that there's life out there. But still wondering, with such a vast universe, it seems sort of inconceivable that there wouldn't be. But then people say, if there is, why haven't we seen it? And other people say, oh, that's because when life becomes intelligent, it immediately blows itself up and doesn't go anywhere. And that's why these failed experiments at life out there, we never see evidence of them. And really nobody knows. And I sort of fascinated and like to believe there's life somewhere out there, but I'm not sure we'll discover it in our lifetimes or any time.
How do people feel when they realize that everything is random and there isn't like a set of rules for everything?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people, there's a human desire to want to have things be controlled and have an explanation. And if something bad happens, there's a reason for it. But I have sometimes seen the other side as well. And one story that really stuck with me, is you'll see why, is I once was giving a big lecture at a high school gym in a nearby town, and there were like 800 people in the audience, and it went really well. And then I was signing books, and everything was great. And then the organizer said, "Oh, can you sign a book for this nice couple here?" There was an older couple. I said, "Oh, sure, nice to meet you, and sure, I'll sign your book." And they said, "Can you make it out to our son?" "Oh, sure, no problem. What's your son's name?" And then they say, "Our son is dead." "Really?" "Yeah, our son died of cancer as a teenager." And what a horrible thing for any family to happen. You can't even imagine it. But then they said to me, and this is what got me, they said, "When your son was dying, we read to him from your book." That was my book, Struck by Lightning. And he took great comfort in it. It's like, really? I mean, I didn't think my book would comfort someone dying of cancer. He said, well, because he realized that this terrible thing that had happened to him, getting cancer as a teenager, unimaginable, that it was just luck. And The alternative is there was a reason for it, which means what? It means he did something wrong. He was bad. He was being punished. And when you stop and think about it in a case like that, to say, everything happens for a reason, or it's all about fate or destiny or karma or whatever, would actually be a horrible message for this teenager to get. And imagine that when you're suffering this horrible thing and you think there's a reason for it, that means you did something wrong. So the parent said that he took great comfort in knowing that it's just random and this really bad thing had happened to him, but it only happened to him just by random chance. He got this terrible disease and it wasn't through his fault. And I was really struck by that, as you can imagine. And it really drove home to me a certain point that, usually I think I sort of have to battle people who think, oh, it's so much more comforting when we say there's reasons and karma and then fate and so on. But maybe it's not so comforting, especially when something really bad happens. Maybe the thing that's comforting is to realize that there's bad luck out there. And despite everything we do, bad things are going to happen. And that really struck with me.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely story, Jeffrey. And to know that those words that you wrote comforted him during those final days is lovely. Yeah. Well, we've covered an awful lot. We could talk on a lot more because it's such an interesting subject. Where can people reach you?
Well, my website is probability.ca. So pretty easy to remember because I'm in Canada and I work with probability. So if you go to probability.ca, you can get links to my books and so on are all there.
Oh, that's great. And one last question. What do you do outside of all this research and being a professor?
Yeah, well, I try to do other things and keep a bit of balance. So I tend to be pretty social and like going to movies and discussing them and things like that. And I also do a little performing. So I do some music and also some improvisational comedy. And I've actually combined those two things in recent years for a while now, which is a lot of times comedy shows want a musical accompanist. So someone who's playing a little music on the side during a comedy show. And with the improvisational comedy, the scene on stage is all being made up. So it means the music on the side also is being all made up. And if something sad happens, you better play some sad chords. And if something romantic happens, you better play a little romantic tune and so on. Or if something scary happens, play some scary notes.
Is that solo improvisational?
Well, in that case, there'd usually be a few actors on stage who are developing a scene together. So they're endowing each other's characters and relationships and so on. And then I'd be the only musician and I'd be on the side with my keyboard usually and playing little notes to try to, highlight or work with what they're doing up on stage. And then also some of the comedians also do a sketch comedy where they've written out a script and practiced everything beforehand. And I'll join in that and I'll do, my bits of music and sometimes even spoof musical songs where they take a standard tune and write spoof lyrics to it. And I'll play along while they sing their spoof song too. So that's something that's a bit different. And, I like to do it because it's pretty different from struggling over a mathematical equation. And, but at the same time, I have found that improvisational comedy or being open to, improvising when things come up has actually helped me with things like teaching and with doing interviews in the media and giving lectures and so on, because if something bad happens, well, I'll try to make a joke out of it instead of just getting upset or rattled. So.
And do you find that when you're up on the stage, how can I put this? It is sort of almost easier to improvise spontaneously with all those people in front of you, as opposed to sort of thinking about it beforehand, do you think?
Well, they both have their easier and harder things. One good thing about improvising is in some sense the standards are lower. That is to say, if you don't play it perfectly, well, that's okay. You're just making it up as you go. Whereas if you've rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed and get it just right, and then you hit one wrong note, well, you've just wasted hours and hours of rehearsing and you've gotten it wrong now. Whereas improv has a certain freeness to it that, whatever happens, you're going with it. So I do like it in a way, not that it's necessarily the highest quality music that I'm playing, but it's the sort of freest in a way. It's like, look, I didn't rehearse anything. Whatever happens, happens. And that's all part of the fun. And that's kind of the spirit of improv is, whatever happens is part of the fun.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, Jeffrey, it's been a really fascinating conversation. It's been interesting to learn more about statistics and almost the dynamic between the science and our human desire to want to believe in how to control our future. With the use of various superstitions, beliefs and charms. My guest today has been Jeffrey Rosenthal. Jeffrey is Professor of Statistics at the University of Toronto and author of several books, with his most recent book being Knock on Wood, Luck, Chance and the Meaning of Everything. You can find a link to Jeffrey's website and to his most recent book in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Jeffrey.
Great, thank you very much.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.